All right, well, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. Our keynote speaker today is Mr. Jason Anderson. It's a great pleasure to welcome him. He's a teacher educator, educational consultant, researcher, and multiple award-winning author. He works in both language teaching and mainstream education and has supported teachers in over 20 countries worldwide, pre-service and in-service for national ministries of education and organisations including UNICEF, the British Council and the University of Warwick. He has published research on aspects of language teaching, multilingualism, teacher reflection, lesson planning, and teacher education. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Jason to take the floor. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you also, Dr. Turkey. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great privilege and an honor to be speaking at this first event for Saudi TESOL. Also for speaking for King Abdulaziz University as well for inviting me, and to Ian particularly for the really interesting discussion we've had about the potential topics for both mine and my colleagues' talks, which I think were earlier today, weren't they? So it's really great to be here. I'll just share it's lovely to see as well, 425 people, that's amazing. That shows a real level of commitment. Right, let me try sharing my screen. How's that? Can we see the screen yet? Ian, give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Great, cool. Excellent. Well, thank you all. I'm just looking at all the chats coming through from all around the world. In fact, some people from Pakistan there. I saw someone from Indonesia earlier, and we'll definitely be making use of the chat. So keep chatting away. If my eyes go up here, it's because I've got a second screen with the chat here. And don't worry if I'm kind of looking up there at any one point. I'm still very much focused on trying to bring everything together. I love webinars where there's a lot of chat going on. Sometimes it's moving so fast you can't see it when there's a lot of participants, but I'll definitely try to keep my eye on that. So there we go. So the talk today, as you can see, I've called it Project-Based Learning in Saudi Universities, an Exploratory Webinar. When I say universities, I suppose I mean any kind of tertiary level institution where learners are often required to either study a lot in English, to involve English in their studies, potentially even doing majors or degrees which are in English themselves. And I'm thinking very much about the skills that they need. But because I'm thinking about that, I'm also thinking about the skills they need before they get to university. So I hope and feel that this webinar will also be relevant for secondary teachers who are preparing students at the first stage towards the skills they'll need for university. And even to a lesser extent, I'm afraid to say, but even to some extent for primary. And definitely if you work in a private language institution, what I'll be presenting here may not be new, it may not be difficult to implement. And in those contexts, you will often find it to be even more relevant and less problematic, so to speak. Okay, so let me just run over the plan for the webinar at this stage. We'll begin by looking at some of the challenges that teachers currently face in tertiary education in Saudi Arabia, and several participants completed a feed-forward questionnaire which I sent out, a kind of a needs analysis which we'll look at. That will be very interesting. We'll look at project-based learning as a possible solution. I'll also give you my own definition of what I mean when I talk about project-based learning. There are lots of definitions out there. We'll look at some ideas for projects so that we'll get a concrete idea of that. And hopefully you guys will be able to also contribute some of your ideas for projects that work in your classroom or projects that you'd like to try out. I'll present an original framework for project-based learning. PBL obviously means project-based, although it can also be used to mean problem-based, which is similar and related, and I'll mention a little bit about that later. And I'll just go through the different stages of the projects to show you how a typical project works its way through or into an English language teaching curriculum. We'll look in particular at ways for presenting the product of the project, and I'll explain a bit more a bit later. And we'll also spend a little bit of time about being critical about project-based learning. We will try to answer the question, why won't it work? But we'll leave that question until a bit later. Until then, hopefully you'll be able to kind of just relax, think about what I'm presenting, and also feel free to chat away in the chat box. There'll also be some useful tips if you feel it is useful, if you think it's going to work in your context as well. Right, now just a few questions for the chat group. If you got your fingers on the keyboard. First question, can you hear me okay? Great. I'm just double checking. It's obvious, you know, sometimes there are glitches. I'm sure the IT team are good there, but I can always make an error here. So great, brilliant. And the second question I'd like to ask you is, what is the weather like wherever you are in the world? Great, sunny. I'm missing the sun. I haven't seen the sun for many days here in England. We got cold as well somewhere there. I would love to be in Riyadh and Jeddah. My father actually spent half of his career living and working in Saudi Arabia, mainly in Jeddah. He was a project planner for hospital building. So he would always send us, this is back in the 1980s and 90s, but he would always send us these beautiful postcards from there. Great, excellent, brilliant. Cool. And then the last question, how are things with the COVID situation there? I'm here in the UK where it's not very good, unfortunately. We're in our third lockdown. So I'm trying to keep myself busy with research and so on. How are you there? Still surviving, under control in some countries. I know many countries are doing much better than we are here in England and the USA, what I would call the developing world at this stage in the virus. Great, alhamdulillah, yes, exactly. Fingers crossed that it will go well. Okay, great. There we go. So the chat is working, and feel free to mention anything you want in the chat, to respond to each other in the chat at any point. Oh, we got rain in Indonesia. Okay, so Indonesia is a bit like UK at the moment. Great. Okay, so another thing to mention at this point is that this is an exploratory workshop. One thing I try to avoid doing is I try to avoid kind of imposing a suggestion about what will and what won't work. I'm very, very interested in the question of methodology, different ways to teach. And as a result, I look at lots of different approaches. I'm very interested in different models for lessons like PPP versus task-based language teaching. I'm very interested in what we call cooperative learning. And I want to just mention the fact that there was a colleague, I did some research with Egyptian teachers in 2016, several of which worked in Saudi Arabia, worked in the kingdom. And one of them mentioned to me something which kind of, when Ian asked me to do a talk, which you know kind of provided some inspiration for this, and that was when he discussed about the problems and how he found solutions to solve them. What he was doing in his own classroom reminded me quite a lot of what we do in project-based learning. So that's kind of one of the sources of inspiration. Ahmed, his name was. I'm not sure if he's watching, but it would be lovely if he is. Okay, so let's have a quick look at some of the challenges that Saudi English language teachers face at university level. You'll find that a lot of these are the same at secondary level. Feel free to chat and to mention some of the challenges that you experience. Just put one or two in the chat box as well. What challenges, and if you're not in Saudi Arabia, feel free to share your challenge and just the country as well. Monolingual learners, that's a reality in the vast majority of the world, in the sense that they all share a different language other than English. There are many places where the learners are multilingual, but monolingual classes in that sense. Right, and here we've got the first challenge coming up very, very strongly. I'm just going to display that. Straight away we can see what is possibly the most frequently mentioned challenge, motivation, and that I will link hopefully clearly to what we're looking at. Little production, reading. Now, reading is a really important one because especially at university level, so much of what they have to read is in English. Academic skills, anxiety, right? So Dua has mentioned something very important, the fear of making mistakes and losing face. When we're speaking in a foreign language in front of our peers, when we're teenagers, especially even late teenagers, young adults, that is a key issue as to why they'll often find it difficult to use English. The affective filter, we got to mention there, of the Krashen idea, which essentially links into the question of motivation as well. Right, wow, fascinating academic writing. So I've got a quote here from one of the respondents to the feed forward who mentioned this idea. I sometimes find it really hard to motivate my learners to participate in class. Motivation and engagement are very, very closely related. Motivation, if you like, is what the student brings with them, and engagement is what they either pick up on or don't pick up on in the lesson itself. Oh, and we've got the issue of proficiency as well. They're just coming up from Gamal. One other challenge that was mentioned in the feed-forward questionnaire was the mixed abilities among learners. And one of the respondents there mentioned this important point: despite placement tests, students come with varying levels and abilities. And this is a really common situation when you get to tertiary level. If you're not aware of something that we call the Matthew effect, the Matthew effect basically tells us that in educational contexts, particularly right from primary level, some students learn well. They often move to the front of the class. The teacher often interacts with them, and they often improve very quickly, whereas the less motivated learners stay at the same level or improve slowly. And as you move through secondary education into tertiary, that gap gets bigger. The Matthew effect gets bigger. And so often we find this. And one of the obvious solutions is to put them into same ability classes in language teaching, where we put all of the students who are at, say, A2 pre-intermediate level together, B1 intermediate together, and so on. And that's definitely one way to deal with it, but there are consequences of doing that, and project-based learning offers opportunities for other ways to group learners as well. I'm just going to look at some of the chats here. Yes, Mirat, short-term motivation. You can often motivate them for a part of a lesson or even for a whole lesson, but it's hard work. There is no simple solution. Yeah, students being forced to participate in classes. Thank you from that, Roa. Yeah, negative attitudes towards the language. And this is a really important point, Ali Mohammed. And it's natural. I remember when I was at school, I didn't want to learn any foreign languages. As a teenager, I didn't really like the idea of speaking a foreign language. And the students are just reflecting what is often a natural feeling there. And again, project-based learning can offer an affordance, a way in which we can avoid necessarily forcing students to use English, but to engage with English. Right, and Wala talks about translation. Remember, Wala, translation is also a tool. I personally translate when I'm learning languages. In my life thus far, I've studied over 10 different languages. I've forgotten the majority of them, but I've used translation at every stage. The culture of spoon feeding, yes. Yes, there's one Egyptian teacher who was working in Saudi mentioned to me once, a lot of the students expect you to to give them the cream and not to make it themselves, as one Arabic saying apparently says. Yeah, rejecting autonomy. Autonomy is something that you will see very clearly here, right? Let me move on a little bit. So we've already mentioned here, you guys have already shared the challenge of practicing speaking skills. And one respondent mentioned in online classes, massively challenging speaking skills in online classes. I've been working recently with teachers in India and sub-Saharan Africa. The vast majority of their learners don't even have access, but when their classes include 50, 60 students. One very interesting inspiration that came from a teacher working in Niger in Africa was he was using WhatsApp and getting students to record their voice and share in a WhatsApp conversation so that they could at least practice speaking and listening to each other, which I thought was ingenious as well. And it's working really well for him. Right, and here is another challenge which I think is really, really important in the kingdom and in the Middle East and in the Arabic-speaking world in general. Materials and textbooks are often found to be irrelevant. No personal investment, no real-world application. Sometimes you get clip art in the book, which we can see is fake, doesn't really represent the learners that we teach. And one of the respondents put a same size fits all syllabus. The reality about language learning syllabi is that they are often same size fits all, but the reality of our learners is that they're not. And then this is a super amazingly big challenge, the pressure to improve learners' English quickly. Students are asked to move from A1 to A2 in about 7 weeks of teaching, one respondent mentioned. And that is a really, really big challenge on its own. And we will come back to that because one of the things that is important for improving learners' English is this issue of motivation. Great, okay. And also mentioned by some of the respondents were class size, especially online class sizes, and developing students' writing skills. Well, you'll see the writing skills coming through in the project-based learning ideas we come up with later. And I'll reference the paper later about where I worked with some Egyptian teachers who are training for taking the CELTA qualification. And one of the things that we were looking at was its relevance to their teaching and their contexts. Afaf, thank you for that lovely comment. My students are superb. Right, so we've got Awad mentioning there that the Ministry of Education, I presume in Saudi, making learning relevant and extremely correlated. I wonder, Awad, if we can develop for Saudi Arabia, for the Middle East, materials and textbooks that are designed around them, whether we need actually the kind of the Western textbooks to create, Western authors to create textbooks for students in the Middle East. I'm sure there are many budding and great authors and publishing companies that should get together to do this as well. Great. Okay, thank you very much. Now, so I'm going to present it a little bit. The next couple of slides, I will be selling project-based learning a little bit, but we will come back and I will be critical about it in a moment. So let's have a look at a kind of an overview of project-based learning, and then I'll go into a more technical definition of it as well. Project-based learning. So the key point I'm going to make here is project-based learning motivates learners. It brings their skills and knowledge together. It makes English relevant to their areas of interest and study and creates real tangible products in English. And I'll talk a bit later about what I mean by products. In ways that often replicate how they will work in their future. Now, I'm just going to take a moment here to think about this. When we think about how many language learners around the world will actually use English in their future jobs, the skill that actually is less likely to be needed is their ability to speak English. Even in their academic studies, reading and writing are far more important skills than speaking. And for this reason, some of us are very interested in looking at ways to create communicative language classrooms that don't necessarily depend on speaking alone or even speaking mainly to get learners working effectively. If you look at a typical working environment, say in the services sector, anywhere around the world where English is being used, there's often a lot of reading in English, documentation, reports, emails. There's sometimes a bit of writing in English that they'll have to respond to emails, that they'll have to write reports. Conversations and discussions among colleagues, especially if they share the same first language, such as Arabic, will tend to be mainly in those languages. But some research I did on translanguaging indicates that nonetheless, there will be English used in those conversations. If you work for an international company, for example, there'll be more English, and there'll be even some companies where spoken English is necessary. But the key point being here is that project-based learning takes your learners' areas of interest, your learners' areas of study, and brings them together. And therefore, we get this link between motivation, what they're interested in, the kind of the intrinsic motivation, the extrinsic motivation in terms of what qualifications they want to get, which will be inspiring them to learn in general. And we bring those together in the English language classroom in project-based learning. So if you like, a very simple way of looking at it is, imagine if we got you and I as a teacher, we got your learners to come up with their areas of interest. So let's just say their areas of interest might include travel, sport, food, and we brought those together with the subjects they're studying either at university level or what they're starting to take interest in secondary level. So that could be tourism, it could be accounting, not that that would be a personal interest of mine. And we try to bring them together and we create a project that does that. The challenge then becomes how to involve English in that. And we'll come on to that in a moment. Okay, thank you very much. Right, let me give you a working definition of project-based learning for language teaching at the moment. This is a definition of my own, which is based on several sources there, which I'll share the references a bit later. So the definition which I've kind of put together here is project-based learning for language classrooms involves learners working in fixed groups for a planned period. So the groups are fixed, the period is planned to research a phenomenon or study a problem and produce a product in the target language. For example, in our case, it's going to be English as evidence of their inquiry. By inquiry here, I mean their research, their project. It is cross-disciplinary, meaning it can include any area of study, which in secondary school could be from maths to science to geography, humanities, social studies, environmental studies, and so on. And other languages potentially. It provides agency to learners. Some of you are mentioning the importance of autonomy, and project-based learning does a lot of that. So the very obvious area of agency is to choose topic focus, which obviously links it back to their areas of interest. It develops what we call higher order cognition. And by this, I mean the thinking skills, which include things like creating, evaluating, analyzing, synthesizing, rather than simply the memorization and regurgitation skills in lower order thinking skills. Excuse me. And it also includes the development of practical skills in collaborative environments that simulate real world contexts. In other words, going back to this idea that when they get beyond the university, they'll be working often in teams in their offices in order to work together to produce separate products, documents, whatever, that will always link to specific work projects. And the same is true in university contexts. If your students are engaged in academic research, project-based learning can be a really good framework to bring that into the English language classroom as well. Mohammed, thank you for that comment. If you don't want to interact with us, don't chat simply. I do want to interact, and we will be interacting, but that will come a little bit later. I'll come up with a question or two in a moment. Okay, great. So language use expectations in project-based learning. One important factor that's likely to be true in Saudi Arabia is that the majority of learners in a classroom will share a language other than English, whether it's their first language or not. There's going to be a lot of Arabic involved in any type of learning, and I personally think that's a good thing. I think we will we'll think a little bit about how and exactly when other languages can be included in the classroom, but on a personal level, I don't see necessarily that's a problem. Now, here's a question for you. There we go, Ali. I told you, Mohammed Ali. I told you they won't be here. Let me tell you, let me ask you a question. What challenges do you face with language use in the classroom? Samaya, thank you for that comment. I completely agree. Other cognitive and metacognitive skills in 21st people go on about 21st century skills a lot, don't they? And here is one of the key points. How do we bring those into the classroom? Project-based learning can be argued to be a way to do that. Okay, so I have to grade our language. Navid agrees with me. L1 isn't necessarily bad interaction. Right, online teaching. Thank you, Dr. Momtajul, very, very challenging there, especially when cameras are off. Switching to L1 when working in groups, just to say, Aziza, that's a completely normal thing. Learners who do that are doing the natural thing. Our challenge as teachers is to get a bit more English into that. Fitness to level, interaction, accuracy, rather, oh, we got the accuracy fluency point there. Thank you, Fatima. And there's lots of different perspectives of that. Lack of motivation again, handwriting and punctuation. And this, Salim, is a really important thing when you're moving from a language such as Arabic, where learners are writing in different direction, using different characters, to a language such as English. We all face challenges. In my language learning background, I've learned several different scripts. I've learned the Devanagari script of northern India, the Ge'ez script of the Abyssinian part of Africa, and also phonemic script, like I'm sure many of you have, and that is a really important one to discuss as well. Yeah. Oh, Zahra, we will come on to PBL. PBL, I suppose, is just means project-based learning, but it can also be used to mean problem-based learning. Great. So yeah, from a personal experience, thank you, Roa. This is the most common issue that we all face. Students who share another language, I prefer not to call them monolingual classes. I call them shared L1 classes. Those students naturally move back into that language, especially if they're teenagers, young adults, they feel more comfortable in that language. So let me tell you about some of the language use expectations that we can expect in project-based learning. We can manage language choice in 3 basic areas. Our inputs, so when we give them project instructions, overview in English, we may want to also manage the documents they get. So we give them some English language texts that feed into their project, sources of information for their research. So the inputs we can easily manage. And if you think about it, that's also true about much future work environments and also academic study as well. The products, the presentations and reports, This is the key area where we can insist on learners doing something monolingually in English. And indeed, we can even, if we want to as teachers, we can even allow Arabic to be used at such times, but to get them to aim towards monolingual use of English. Because often in an international work environment, you may have to or want to or need to present products in English. And I'll come onto what types of products we can focus on a little bit later. Interaction with you, the teacher. So the very obvious point is that when you're working with the students, for example, when you visit a group to consult them, to work with them, you can speak English. It may be that if your learner's English proficiency is still very low, you may allow them or even encourage them to use the mother tongue, other languages, so that you can respond to them and even scaffold what they wanted to say in English into English yourself. However, especially at lower levels, learners can be allowed to use any languages when working on the project in their groups. As learners move on to higher proficiency, then we can encourage discussions in English, and we can do that through all kinds of means, similar to how we would do in other types of collaborative learning, group-based learning, task-based learning. We can do things like awarding praise, awarding prizes. If you have a little competitive element in your classes, you may give some groups extra points for doing more in English. And then if you want to be a bit stricter, a bit more draconian, you can even have I've sometimes used the yellow card, red card method, that if you hear a group speaking the wrong language, you show them a yellow card, and then a red card could mean they lose 1 point from their project outcomes, that kind of thing. But there's an important difference here to task-based language teaching, and one of you posted a question already. Thank you for that good question, Galia. Is project-based learning the same as task-based learning? No, it's not. Task-based learning is based on the idea that we set up a task itself and learners use English to interact, use language meaningfully, in response to which we provide them with help with the language that they need to do that task more effectively. So task-based language teaching, the core of it, if you like, the focus of task-based language teaching is for them to do something in English. In project-based learning, that's a bit different. It's much more to do with getting them to do something with English and moving something into English. So that means that the spoken interaction doesn't necessarily need to be in English. The spoken interaction could be in Arabic, could be in a combination of languages. Again, if you get them to work on something where there's a text where they're producing something in English, even if they're speaking Arabic, you'll find that they will translanguage a lot. They will employ a lot of English. By translanguaging, I mean, by the way, bringing languages together in more complex ways, what is sometimes called code mixing or code switching. They will bring languages together and they will start to employ more English as they gain confidence. And I've seen this happening in a few contexts around the world. Great. So there we go. A slight difference to task-based language teaching. And also the other key difference to task-based language teaching is that project-based learning is often a much longer, if you like, task cycle. Right, let me just, okay. Have a quick look at some of these comments. Oh, we got it. Reem, that's an interesting point, translingualism. Yes, exactly. Reem mentions a point there in the comments. According to translingualism, and mentions Kanagaraja's work on this, it is completely natural for speakers of multiple languages to code switch in order to create meaningful communication, right, Reem? And what's really interesting there, Reem, and for anybody who's noticed, if you've noticed your students using lots of languages together, as Reem says, it's natural. As many of us have argued, it's natural. And what you'll find is as their proficiency in the target language, English, increases, that the percentage of English in those conversations will also increase. And you can see this happening a lot in ESL environments as well. As a result of this, I would argue that project-based learning is more authentic than, for example, task-based language teaching that kind of attempts to create a monolingual English-speaking group amongst people who would never naturally use English together. Project-based learning looks at this idea of we need to produce something in English, but we will use all of our resources to do so. Saad asks a question, is STEM PBL? Not quite, no. STEM is much more to do with the specific area of subject focus, but you will see that project-based learning is very, very important for STEM. And if you're teaching students who are on STEM-related qualifications, project-based learning can definitely help them with that. So let's have a look at, when I asked you to talk about your challenges, I also asked you to share some of your solutions to your challenges, and how project-based learning relates to this. And I just want to go over some of these because I thought this was really interesting. Two of you, if you look at the two solutions on the left here, mentioned the issues of personalization and engagement by making the learning more relevant to the students' own worlds. So giving them more topics that are personalized and relevant to their local living environment. And the other respondent there mentions, once I leave the course book and start giving external materials, they become more active. And the issue is to try to maintain that level of activeness, but to focus them also on the learning aims that we are moving towards. So those two, most definitely project-based learning will link to the ideas that you two have come up with for finding solutions to the challenge of motivation. Three of you mentioned, if you look at the top right, there's three very interesting solutions there that relate to the issue of getting learners to work together to collaborate, but there's still challenges there. So one of you mentioned grouping weaker students with stronger students. That can work. A real tip here is that works very well in pairs and in small groups, but when you move into bigger groups, 5 or 6, and I won't be recommending groups of over 6, you'll often find that, as some of you have mentioned, the stronger students tend to do the majority of the work. When we're teaching online, we can use breakout groups to get them working together. And you'll see that project-based learning is quite amenable to online teaching because of the fact that breakout groups often take quite a long time to arrange. Project-based learning, you can even get them to arrange their own Zoom webinars within their groups, and you visit the separate webinars to chat to them and to interact with them. And then, yeah, two of you also mentioned the issue of the course materials. So finding time to tailor the course to everyone's needs, and it needs more of a team effort to produce the materials. I couldn't agree more. And if you're working in a university environment, it is definitely possible to create supplementary materials that link to what the learners are studying outside of the English classroom, link to their academic needs in terms of the skills that they all need to show at BA and MA level, but also link to the language learning aims which you need to achieve. And that for me is the first stage towards creating materials that's independent of the kind of the global EOT course books and more relevant to Saudi and international students' needs. Okay, let's get practical now. What I'd like you to do is to share some of your ideas for possible projects in the chat. These could be projects that you've done recently in your class, ones you've heard about other teachers doing, and also ones that you would like to do or you've maybe thought about doing but never done. And I'll just give you one example of a project, a very simple project that students research and then present on an English song that they love. So that they maybe work in small groups or pairs to do a bit of research on a song, look at some of the language in there, and then they present to the rest of the class on the song. They maybe listen to it, maybe sing along, and then some of the language that they learned from it, and also the meaning of the song and why it's important to them. So have a think and share some ideas of projects that you think are useful or could be useful and interesting for your learners. It's interesting. I think we've got a troller here on the chat. Mohammed Ali is definitely trying to put forward his opinion, and there's no reason why that shouldn't be the case. I think online education is definitely a challenge. I have to agree to some extent. We have to still try to teach them, in my opinion, though. Thank you, Afaf, for a nice bit of praise there. Okay, so here we go. Sorry, I was on the wrong part of the chat. Right, so we've got some interesting ideas here. We get some language learning ideas using phrasal verbs from Gamal, some work-related ideas, starting a business. Samira, absolutely agree with that. I'll show some ideas for business-related projects. Creative posters, brilliant idea. Personal posters about one's life. Abdullah, that's a really interesting idea and works really well at low levels and especially at secondary levels as well. Oh, wow, so many ideas. We'll have to zoom back to these. 1 second, if I can slow it down. Sometimes you can. Create Google Slides. Okay, Google Slides about what? Now here, Mohammed Abu Uaf, choosing a country to travel to, collecting information. Travel-related projects are brilliant because students often can find lots of information in English more than they'll find in their first language, especially if it's an English-speaking country. Brilliant idea there. Oh, wow, look at this, Rana. I asked my students to create frequently asked questions about coronavirus. That is a brilliant idea. And what's interesting, Rana, about that idea is they can then share their questions and answers in English. Or it might be that they found the answers in English and they need to share with other speakers of their same first language about what the English language kind of websites are saying about coronavirus as well. Very interesting there to make it relevant to the current challenges. Fatima, one idea we presented at beginners level was look up countries and present their foods, cultures, clothes. Brilliant again, Fatima, brilliant idea. Yeah, so that then you can group students in terms of their preferred country, or you could group them that one group of students who are very interested in food. I don't think anyone isn't, but one group who are very interested in clothes, maybe I'm not so interested in that. And so we could get together in groups and present our ideas about topics that we're interested in, but specifically look at countries. I worked with an Indian teacher who did something very, very similar to that. It was really, really interesting. So many ideas, cultural tourism, storytelling about community issues. Want to buy, oh, this is interesting, Gamal. Want to buy a car but have little money. So there we've got a kind of a kind of a role play situation, but we can also turn the role play into a larger project as well. So that students, for example, some of you mentioned that you didn't have the materials you sometimes need. Well, the nice thing about project-based learning is students can even create the materials, for example, for a role play in English, and then they can share them and do them in the class, maybe giving them to a different group to do a role play. Galia's got an interesting English language research project there, finding English words that sound like an Arabic word and then discussing, and students can present on aspects of how English pronunciation and Arabic pronunciation varies, and how they can help each other to learn English. Yeah, brilliant. And there's that classic research topic there, Youssef, students research and present on the top 5 places to visit in their own country. And then that's nice, that can often link to a voting activity as well. So many ideas. How are we doing for time? Okay, I'm gonna have to move on a little bit. Brilliant ideas, 65 messages I haven't even had time to read. Okay, thank you for that, guys. Really, really interesting. It's moving so fast, I can't even scroll down. Okay, great. I'm going to have to go back to my slides now. Thank you so much. Right. Let me show you 6 ideas for ESL and ELT projects, moving from easier to more challenging. The classic kind of simple idea that all of us, I think, can do in our classrooms is research and present projects. A research and present project can be useful. You can put students into pairs. Often pairs work better on this. And if you do put a stronger and a weaker learner together, because they're in pairs, the weaker learner will naturally feel an obligation to do some work as well. Even if they can't necessarily do as much in English, they may do background reading and research. They can then present. We tend to often use PowerPoint for presentations. Have a think about TED Talks. One interesting thing about TED Talks is people very rarely use slides. And if you want your students to present a TED type talk, then as well as the usefulness of the PowerPoint presentation to help them to remember English words, for a TED type talk, they have to memorize a huge amount of English that will help them in an English speaking exam. It will help them when they are doing future presentations. Whilst we tend to look down on memorization in some contexts, memorization for speaking presentations is a really important skill and something which I've done a lot of in my time as a speaker of this on this kind of event. One very obvious idea is writing projects. These could include creative writing projects, newspaper article writing projects, or online newspaper writing projects. They can be fictional or true, narratives or news stories. Now, many clever students will often, if you ask them to do a kind of a news writing story, they'll copy and paste from the internet. So some interesting ideas for this can be, you have to create a story which is maybe a fictional news story involving several famous people, and you can create some cards with different names so that that they come up at random, and then about a specific topic or scandal that it can link to. You could also get them to find news stories in their university or secondary school campus or context, and then they can write about those and put them together for a newspaper. Let's have a look at some more ideas. Design problem projects. Now, this is where projects start to get really interesting, where we start to engage students' higher order thinking skills, such as evaluating and creating. Very simple projects can relate to the English language classroom or any classroom. Remember, for students, classrooms are a big part of their life. So something like Design the Perfect Classroom can engage them well. Another project that's mentioned in a reference that I'll show to you later: design a monument to a leading figure in our country, design a park for wildlife and people in our city, design an invention for, in the UK, we have a TV show called Dragon's Den. I don't know if you have it in your country, but basically students have to come up with an idea and then present it to a team of experts who, if they like it, they'll provide funding. And preparation for a Dragon's Den type pitch can be a really useful project as well. And again, in all of those, there's a degree of agency. When they're designing a monument to a leading figure, they can choose the figure they want. When they're designing a park, they can choose a specific part of their city or town, a local area that makes it relevant as well. And then one of you mentioned, again, I can't remember who it was, but business related stuff. Many of your students, especially at university level, will be on business related courses. And so business problem projects can be really, really useful. So let's imagine there's a cafe that's not doing very well. They have to work out how to save that cafe. And we as teachers could create a project brief, but the students could create a project brief for each other. So Group A could design a brief about the problems with the cafe and, kind of a text which they then give to another student who then provide the solution or come up with a solution. You could have a tech-related project such as an app-based language learning service. They could improve a well-known business or community resource, for example, a local supermarket chain. Excuse me. An airport or a train station, so that they come up with an idea for how to make this place work better. And because it's localized, because it's specific, it's often a much more realistic project. And then we've got research projects. Many of your students will be moving towards research degrees if they are. A research project can often start by simply posing a research question. Let's take the question: is social media a positive or a negative influence on our lives? Well, we could get students to work out how they will research it. For example, they might want to do interviews across the university campus. They might want to do an online questionnaire that they share on Facebook, and then they present the findings. And that is extremely relevant to their own research at a university level, especially if they're at MA level, where they're required to do a lot more in-depth dissertation and to demonstrate understanding of research methods. Other examples might be: are students happy with the university services? You create a question that's directly related to the university and could potentially help the university to improve as well. And then one which might relate to our families and parents: how has life changed since our parents were children? This is a really good one at secondary level, that children can go home, interview their parents in the mother tongue, and then come back, get together in a group, and then share their findings and then present on that. And then the last one I'd like to present, and this is the most challenging one usually, but it's interesting, you can even do this at quite simple level: real product projects. So develop a website for English learners planning to take an important exam. Maybe your university has a specific exam. Well, why not create a support website? You could get the students to create different pages for it, research it, produce exercise and materials, and so on. They could plan a school social event. It would have to be an online event nowadays, but in the future, inshallah, we will hopefully be able to get back together again. They can set up or improve an invited speaker events calendar for the school. So, for example, if you're finding this guy a bit boring, we could maybe get the students to think of people to invite for future events. And we could even get them to design subject-specific learning posters, and we could put them up in the university canteen. Several of you mentioned projects which involve posters, and it's important to note that posters don't have to come from the teacher. It takes a lot of time and energy. Use the learner's energy, use the learner's motivation to produce those. Now, these are 6 ideas which I found work in a wide variety of different contexts, kind of 6 basic ideas for projects. I'll now move on to the framework for project-based learning that I promised earlier. So looking at a framework for project-based learning, a lot of us think a lot about introducing the project, students working on the project, and then presentation of the products. But it's important to think about what happens before that and after that, the planning stage and the assessment and reflection stage. In the planning stage, we need to think about groups, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We need to think about calendar. So, for example, if you're teaching the students every day of the week, you might want to take the last hour of the day when they're tired, when they're sometimes demotivated, to work on projects. That's a possibility. But also how long it will take. 1 project per term is often about right, that students will work both in class at times and then after lessons by getting together as a group. A project brief, in other words, a document that describes the project, clarity about the presentation format, and also clarity about the assessment criteria, which you as a teacher need to work out and present to the students at the start so that they know what they're working for. And I'll come back to that in a moment a little bit. When we introduce the project, obviously this is going to need to have a handout that we'll often have to create, but that's one handout that can last for a long time. Deal with questions and answers, and then check learner understanding of the project, because especially if, for example, you're doing an online project, they then go into breakout groups, you need to make sure they're working on the right thing. When they're working on the project, there's 2 main things that students do. They do the background research and then they develop the project. The development often involves, develop the product. The development often involves a lot of thinking, interacting together, and the background research often involves resources. Depending on the project, you may want or allow them to do the background research, drawing on Arabic or whatever their mother tongue is, but also you can create the kind of project where there are resources in English that they will want to access, so that they actually need or want to access English to do this. For example, if it's a project about an English language speaking country, or a project about something about which simply there is more information in English on the internet, and a possible outcome might be to then also produce more information in Arabic on it. The teacher's role at this stage is important. The main role for the teacher is resource. In other words, when they want help, advice, guidance, you provide that. And you'll often find that you'll spend 15 minutes with each group, interacting with them, finding out how it's going, and then giving them some advice. Formative assessor, all the time during a project, you're giving them feedback on how to improve their project, how to develop. And that's an example of formative assessment. But also at different stages in the project, you can give them kind of guidance about other ideas and feedback on their language use as well. So, for example, if they're writing initial documents, you can give them feedback on any errors that are common there. You can be a catalyst, you can come up with ideas to inspire them more. You can be a critic. And if your students are working at a high level of kind of critical engagement, you can kind of put ideas into that, tell them why their project might not work, suggest why their ideas are maybe not so useful. And also you can be a guide as well for them. So you can, wherever required, you can give them language learning input particularly. But notice that your role isn't simply there as a language learner. Question there about assessment rather than evaluation. Evaluation is part of the assessment, and I'll come on to that in a moment, Dalal. Presentation of the products, I'll come on to that later, but you can have a product launch, product posters, presentations, a website can be the product, and the reports can also be part of it. And then here we go. Here's the issue about evaluation and assessment. Now, assessment and reflection, teacher assessment can be an important part of the project. And sometimes university English language centers or English language institutes can apportion a certain amount of learners' year marks or marks on a specific course to continuous assessment, which is based on the projects that they produce during the course. And then the mark is shared between the students in a specific project group as an alternative means of assessment. Peer evaluation is really useful. Just think about where you get students to create posters and then everyone votes for their favorite poster. That's peer assessment. And the best posters can get the most marks, if you like, but you can create kind of criteria that they're not allowed to vote for their own project poster. And if you're high-tech IT savvy, you can think of ways that they can vote online and provide qualitative feedback as to why they like the one they like. And again, they can do that in English, and that's more English-related learning. And then, of course, there's group self-evaluation. You can get the group to evaluate how they've done and to complete some kind of document about what they learned from the project and what they would like to do in the future. Okay. I'll have to move on because things are moving really fast, but an interesting point there from Mustafa. Students doing quite well in 3 of the 4 steps. Yeah. Okay, great. And Gabriel, my students create a YouTube channel. You can create, that's a great idea. You can create a class YouTube channel. So this framework, I'll show a link to it at the end of my talk. And if you want, you can kind of come back to it and possibly use it to set up your own project. Now let's have a quick look at a few presentation formats for projects. As I mentioned earlier, they can be presentations to the class, and these can involve PowerPoint presentations. And normally, if they're in a group, each group member contributes. One of the things I mentioned is that it's important to keep the group small, never more than 5 usually, and usually 4 is a good maximum. Written presentations, they can create a report as part of the project. So the report may not be the main thing, but it can also be part of it. And if you think about a report and the language it will use, that will often be very relevant to future work-related environments. And they can submit an article, for example, for a university publication or for a website, a blog. Online presentations, we've got blog posts, websites, YouTube, vlogs, that kind of thing. Drama presentations can be interesting. So if they're researching an important historical event, they might want to do a drama presentation on that. For example, in America, one thing that's quite common in US schools is to get students to enact important moments from American history. And I've got a colleague who's done that recently, very interestingly, posted on YouTube with the learners' permission and their parents as well, obviously. Pitch presentations, I mentioned a little bit about Dragon's Den, but Dragon's Den is essentially like pitching to the board of directors in a work environment. And then we've got poster presentations where different groups can put up their posters in a classroom or a hall, and everybody can go around with some members of the group staying by their poster and talking about it to people who come and visit. They can launch a product. So if they're creating a website, then the launch itself can be the presentation. And the publication of a research article is also a possible outcome for students who are working on MA and even PhD qualifications as a means to kind of produce a result of that project that is actually a first kind of achievement in their academic careers. Okay, now let's move on to challenging project-based learning. I promised I'd do this, and I'm a bit short of time, but had some really interesting comments in the feedback. This is the most important challenge, I think, that one group member could end up doing the majority of the work to compensate for others. And one of you also mentioned that these people are hangers-on and they come and work and they please. Well, the first tip there is to keep the group small, because if you do, the group will manage themselves. But also to create some kind of documents whereby the individuals and the group as a whole evaluate their own performance in the project and evaluate the balance of work. Just because I don't have very good English, I could still contribute lots to the project by researching in other languages, by maybe checking something online, by even using online tools. Who's to say we can't use Google Translate if we want to start to create documents in English? So keeping groups small, I think, is a really useful solution to that. But I completely agree that that is a challenge that we have to keep working on in project-based learning. And another important thing there is working out how to create the groups. This, I think, is a really interesting point, and I completely acknowledge this. It works really well at high school and middle school levels, where we can often interact with teachers of other subjects more easily. And in a language-only setting, it may waste time. And I want you to keep in mind this person's comment. This is, I'm sure, an experienced teacher, and it may be a reason why it may not work in your context. But just to provide a counter-argument, a possible one. For example, in some universities, you can get lecturers who work in specific departments to interact with you to provide suggestions for what they could do as projects in the English language learning classroom. That makes it relevant to their other subjects. What about the other situation that, for example, at a certain time a week, maybe 2 hours a week, we stop grouping students according to ability levels and we group them according to the area of their research, of their university studies, their major. So you get all of the people who are looking at business management into one class, all ability levels, and you give them a business management project. If you've got a large number of them, you can even then group the, if you want to, ability levels together and give them projects that are differentiated to their levels, or rather outcomes in terms of what you expect from them. But there's a suggestion there that just because you group them according to language learning ability doesn't mean for project-based learning you have to do that. But to maintain that key point, I think this person has got a really important point, and it needs to be borne in mind as we think critically about project-based learning. Now, here's the kind of the other challenge that links to that is the curriculum. Everybody has a curriculum. How do we fit it in? And the issue is here, if we can get project-based learning into the curriculum as part of a continuous assessment, then it can help to make it feasible, to make it easier as part of the project. So that we can get it onto the curriculum, and we can even apportion time within the curriculum. But bear in mind that when you motivate learners to work on a project, you often find that you can apportion homework time for them to get together and work on the project. Even if in class you want to focus on what you normally focus on, you can spend maybe half an hour a week working with 2 of the groups to see how their project is going. If learners are motivated to work on a project, they can sometimes and will sometimes work on it independently. But I don't want to undermine any of these comments. I think all of these are 3 really important challenges for project-based learning, reasons why it may not work in your context, why you may need to experiment with it carefully initially, and why essentially you may have to adapt it to your context. Now, how am I doing for time? I'm zooming along, but I've still got just one more kind of key slide. Just a few important tips. Create your groups carefully. Looking at the literature on what we call cooperative learning, there are arguments for creating same ability groups so that there are no hangers-on, if you like. And there are also arguments for creating mixed ability groups, but making sure that the group ensures everybody contributes equal amounts of work. It may not be equal amounts of English language writing or whatever, but equal amounts of work. And certainly in presentations, you'd expect them all to contribute. But the basic rule of thumb is groups of 3 to 4 tend to work best for projects. That creates an opportunity for the group to manage themselves. Planning is key. Timeframes need to be realistic. Assessment criteria need to be provided a priori before the project. The project rubric, the description of the project and so on, all has to be on, if you like, the handout you give them, including the calendar. Teacher roles. In the early stages of the project, focus on making sure they understand the project and they are on task. Remind them about the assessment criteria at that stage. And later on, as I mentioned earlier, spend time with each group, getting an update and offering critical feedback. And plan your first project as a project. So here's an idea. If you work in a university context, like Abdulaziz University, King Abdulaziz University, it may be possible for you to create a working group to design some projects for a group of you to implement it together, to experiment with that, and then to provide feedback as part of the CPD program to your colleagues. And as one very wise respondent to my initial questionnaire mentioned, the challenge would be to make the management see the value of it. And it may be that both you and the management decide that it's maybe not for us. And that is a legitimate outcome of a workshop like this. Nothing wrong with that, to critically reject something if it doesn't fit your needs. But if you can present it in this way to colleagues and to management, then hopefully you can create space for project-based learning so that learners are motivated and engaging with something that will be relevant to their future work needs and to real-life language use contexts. Oh, well, I've zoomed through that. I know I've got through that in about an hour, but I'm also concerned that I haven't addressed many of your questions and so on. So I'm sure Ian will pop back in soon and we can maybe discuss that as well. If you use the QR codes, and my slides are on my website, www.jasonanderson.org.uk, and you'll find these slides there. But the 2 useful resources are PDF documents that you can also download as well. Great. So, Ian, I suspect everyone is too busy to hang around for questions. Am I right?
Well, I think they love for you to answer a few questions, Jason.
I'd be very happy, and I'm just sorry, I went on a bit too much there early on. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, not at all, not at all, please.
Great. So shall we have a look at some of the questions in the question and answer section? Would you like to come back online, Ian? And then we can discuss them together. It's quite nice sometimes to have a chat. Great. So I can see in some of the questions, well, we've discussed the one about project-based learning being the same as task-based learning. Yes, and Galea also mentions this point. In project-based learning, the outcome is the goal, but in task-based learning, the process is the goal. Galea, you've put that in much more eloquent language than I actually did. Thank you so much for that. Yes, in a way, project-based learning, you're aiming towards the product, and that is what we evaluate. Whereas in TBLT, it's often the interaction that you evaluate and you respond to. Any thoughts on that one there, Ian?
Wow, it's very succinct, that, isn't it?
Yeah. Let's have a look at another one. Which one do you think is interesting and useful for your university? We've got some nice questions. If you've got a question, put it in the question and answer, because the chat is moving so quickly, it's often impossible. Ian, which of those questions do you think is interesting?
Well, there was a question earlier about the difference between assessment and evaluation.
Mm.
Is that?
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting, actually, isn't it? For me, assessment is the overall term, and evaluation is often a type or a way or a means to assessment. It's often a collocation thing as well. We tend to talk about self-evaluation, peer evaluation, peer assessment you can have, but there's often no difference in terms of the actual processes themselves, but we talk about formative assessment rather than formative evaluation versus summative. And I think for me personally, when we're talking about assessment of learners, either as formative or summative, continuous on the course, we often use that word, whereas evaluation, it often relates to myself or to my peers. Any thoughts on that one, Ian? It's a difficult one.
Gosh.
Yeah, and Gabriel, interestingly, you talk about groups all the time, Gabriel says. Is it possible for PBL to be a solitary activity? Is it not? Gabriel, I've not thought about it, actually. I have to be honest, I've always used it as a means to bring learners together and to get them interacting and to using that team as a learning resource. I'm quite a strong believer in cooperative learning. But definitely students can work on individual projects. And one simple example of that would be where they research something and present. The first type of project that I showed you earlier, they can do that individually. And you can even find that with research question projects, students may find that they have a question that nobody else has. Individual learners, some learners don't like working together. They prefer to work individually. And if we want to be inclusive in our classrooms, then we often need to create space and time for that to happen. And projects are no different in that sense. So yes, they can be individual. Really interesting question here. Amalia. How to properly assess a project? Is letter scoring sufficient? What are the criteria? Okay, it really will depend. Let's imagine you've got a project which involves the students doing an oral presentation at the end, maybe with slides, but also where they write a report about the project. Okay, then you could apportion 50% of the marks to the written report, and that helps the learners to focus on their writing skills, and 50% to the presentation, for which 25% is the PowerPoint and 25% is their actual performance. And for each part, you will create criteria. So in the performance, it would have to have an interesting start, confident speaking. You could have marks for use of English, but also other things. You know, it's not just about the English in the marks. Other things in the presentation, so that every team member contributes to the presentation and so on. And so you've got a load of checklists, and you, the teacher, can maybe record those presentations and then watch them back again to provide marks. Because projects are often quite long, you will only have to do that once a term, rather than kind of the continuous marking that we have to do if we're doing writing. And I'm not saying that isn't important. I believe in it a lot, but that's one of the things about projects, that you can really carefully create those assessment criteria. Remember to give them at the start of the project, and then the learners know what to work towards. Time for one more, Ian? Any there that are interesting for you?
I was thinking that assessment is one of the first things you do, I imagine, when you're looking at a project. Our learners are very sort of results driven, so they would need to know exactly how they were being assessed on these projects from the get-go, I think. So yeah, I guess it's one of the first things you do. Was Dr. Turkey? Dr. Turkey?
Welcome, Dr. Turkey.
And I'm fine. No, I'm just listening to you guys.
Great. If you want to chip in with any of your experience as well, feel free to do so, because it's very interesting.
Myself, I have been introduced to project-based learning when I was doing my MA, which was not that recent. I think most of the ideas, if you mentioned, are great ideas. Students generally learn by doing things, and having them in a project, I think it create other, not only the learning itself, but actually they play together as teamwork to achieve a goal. So I think the group motivate each other in completing the task, and that's really what motivates students more.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Or instructions and stuff, and that promotes autonomy, learning, and self-directed learning, and all that kind of thing. So I that's what I could say as a professional in the
So wise. Yeah, cooperative learning is one of those key terms that often is misunderstood and presumed to be the same as collaborative. If you look at the cooperative learning literature specifically and what it recommends, a lot of what you said there, Dr. Turkey, is exactly what it's suggesting, and it can be brought together with project-based learning to make both more effective as well. And then I suppose our challenge there is to work out, if we work in a university department like you two do, to work out whether we can create the opportunity for our curriculum to create space for project-based learning, continuous assessment, which is a type of alternative assessment rather than the high stakes exams at the end. If you apportion 20% of the marks to project-based learning, that will motivate them in one very real sense, but it also reduces the stress of everything being assessed at the end of the course as well. So
great. Yeah. Do we have any more questions, or?
Lots there. There's a few there.
Jason, so you can go ahead. We still have time.
Great. So many interesting questions there as well. Gabriel just mentions, can you take us back to the stages of project development slide? Gabriel, if you click on the link, one of those two QR codes, I'm not sure if they'll work on your screen, but we'll show you that slide on a PDF document. So feel free to have a look there. Yes, Sadia mentions a really important question. How significant is it to specify the time limit in PBL? Should a delayed project submission affect the assessment criteria? That second question is a tricky one. It's a personal one, depending on your context. But specifying time limits is really important. You need to look at, I called it a calendar, because you need to work out how often on a weekly basis students will work on it. I know, for example, in many departments in Saudi, teachers are expected to get students' levels to increase really quickly. And so you can often only apportion a little bit of class time, maybe once or twice a week, to working on a project, even if they're full-time students. But make sure that time is kind of kept separate for the projects. And whilst it may seem a little bit above and beyond the call of duty, you can even, as a teacher, sometimes apportion time after lessons for learners to have little group tutorials with you about their projects. If you set up a project initially and then you do those tutorials, then often you'll find that they're more productive than individual tutorials with learners, and often because they're in groups, it takes less time. But basically, you want to apportion some time every week, but also if your students aren't engaging with homework, think about using the project as the homework, so that they have to get together in their group 3 times a week to work for 1 hour on their project. And then you'll expect an update maybe every week, or on some kind of email communication, or some kind of document that will let you know about how their project is going on. And of course, you can encourage that update in English, and that's more realistic English language use as well. So yeah, to put that into, so you need, every week you need to work out what time how much time you're going to spend on the project, but also make it really clear about deadlines, so that after 1 month, they have to produce an initial report. After 2 months, they have to produce a second report on how it's going, or send you an email. And then at the end of the project, there is a date where they have to be ready and hand in everything, or do presentations. And yes, if one group is late to do the presentation, you as a teacher may want to apportion some kind of, as we tend to do anyway in university context, some kind of penalization for handing it in late. But there may always be mitigating reasons. And at this difficult time with COVID around the world, obviously, I'm sure you and I would be understanding if that was an issue. Can I answer one more question? Roa has asked a question that's really dear to my heart. Roa Niazi, I'm very keen of the idea of integrating translanguaging into monolingual classrooms, like the ones in my context. Do you think encouraging learners to translanguage while doing project-based learning would enhance the learning process? It's a really interesting question. On a personal level, I would, yes. And I believe that often, as opposed to, if you like, the Western monolingual ways of language teaching and learning, we often see learners as being people who are just rubbish at English. And what we need to recognize is that they are already fluent, capable communicators and language users. And rather than simply stopping them from using the mother tongue and telling them to do everything in English, an alternative way is to create opportunities for them to use the mother tongue, to talk about English, to produce things in English. And if you look at the translanguaging literature, started in Wales, interestingly, in the UK, with a gentleman called Chen Williams. And what he was doing was exactly essentially what we do in project-based learning. He was giving inputs in one language, like English, and getting them to produce products in Welsh. And what he was finding was, as they were working on the project, they were translanguaging a lot. They were mixing languages. They were drawing on English words in their Welsh, or it could be Arabic conversations. And as they gained proficiency, that often changed so that they were speaking more in the target language and just using the mother tongue when they didn't need it. So you have a kind of a slowly scaffolded switch from Arabic mainly to English mainly interaction, without ever banning or forcing them to use one language. That's the theory. In practice, we often as teachers have to achieve certain goals where it may be necessary to be more strict about language use requirements. It's an interesting thing to bear in mind, but we should never kind of have one specific set of rules with language use, but to be flexible. That's my opinion. Universities may have specifications.